The gunshot echoed across the Montana plains as Xavier Grayson cradled the still warm letter in his calloused hands, his world shattering faster than the setting sun could dip below the jagged horizon. The year was 1879, and in the span of one bullet, he'd become a widower and the sole guardian of 4 infants who weren't even his own. Xavier stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, the sprawling grasslands of Montana Territory stretching before him like an ocean of golden wheat. At 30 years old, he'd seen his share of hardship, but nothing had prepared him for this. His sister Sarah and her husband John, along with their newborn quadruplets, had been on their way to visit when their stagecoach was ambushed. John died defending his family, and Sarah, critically wounded, had only enough strength to write a desperate letter before succumbing to her injuries. "I entrust my children to you, Xavier. You are all they have now." Those words weighed heavier than any burden he'd ever shouldered. 4 babies, 3 girls, and 1 boy, all of them just 3 months old, with tiny fists and hungry mouths. They'd arrived with the local doctor who had tried in vain to save Sarah, delivered to his doorstep along with the news that would forever change his life. Inside the house, the cacophony of wailing infants pierced through the evening air. Xavier pushed his black Stetson back on his head and ran a hand through his dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples. His ranch hands kept their distance, unsure how to help a man whose expertise lay in breaking horses, not changing diapers. "Mr. Grayson," his foreman Jackson approached cautiously. "We've sent Billy into town for supplies. Milk, cloth for diapers, whatever else babies might need." Xavier nodded, his throat too tight for words. He'd spent the last decade building the Double G Ranch into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory. He knew every inch of his 5,000 acres, could predict storms by the smell of the air, and could calm the wildest Mustang with just his voice and patience. But these tiny humans, they terrified him more than any stampede ever could. The crying intensified, and Xavier stepped back into the house. The babies lay in makeshift beds, dresser drawers lined with blankets. Their faces were red with exertion, tiny fists flailing against the injustice of hunger and discomfort. "I don't know what you need," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to do this." He awkwardly picked up the smallest girl, holding her as if she might shatter. He'd named them according to Sarah's wishes, written in her final letter. This was Lily, the runt of the litter as his ranch hands had tactlessly observed. The others were Rose, Daisy, and the boy, Thomas, named after their grandfather. Lily's cries quieted momentarily as she stared up at him with unfocused blue eyes. Then her face crumpled again, and the wailing resumed with renewed vigor. "I reckon they're hungry," Jackson said from the doorway, looking as uncomfortable as Xavier felt. "Billy won't be back for hours yet." Xavier felt panic rising in his chest. 4 hungry babies and not a drop of milk in the house. Their survival had just become his responsibility, and he was already failing. "I can ride to the Nelson place," Jackson offered. "They've got a new baby, too. Maybe Mrs. Nelson could spare some milk." "It's 10 miles in the dark," Xavier said, bouncing Lily awkwardly. "And we need a more permanent solution." The sound of wagon wheels crunching on the dirt path outside drew their attention. It was too early for Billy's return. Xavier handed Lily to a startled Jackson and strode to the door, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Through the gathering dusk, he saw a small wagon pulled by a single horse, driven by a woman he didn't recognize. Strangers in these parts were rare and often trouble. He stepped onto the porch, his stance wide and cautious. The wagon stopped, and the woman set the brake. She was dressed simply in a faded blue dress, her honey-brown hair pulled back under a practical bonnet. When she turned toward the house, Xavier could see she was young, perhaps 25, with a determined set to her jaw that spoke of someone who had weathered her own storms. "I heard there was trouble out at the Double G," she called, climbing down from the wagon. "I'm Felicity King, from over at Sweetwater Creek." Xavier recognized the name. The Kings had settled about 15 miles east, but he'd never met the daughter. He'd heard the parents had died in a fever outbreak last winter. "Xavier Grayson," he replied, tipping his hat. "Not sure what you heard, but the unified wailing from inside the house grew louder, and Felicity King's eyebrows rose. "I heard your sister's babies arrived," she said, reaching into the wagon and pulling out a cloth-covered basket, "and that you might need some help." She climbed the porch steps with confident strides, the basket in her arms emitting a yeasty, warm smell that momentarily distracted Xavier from his panic. "Fresh bread," she explained, pulling back the cloth to reveal several golden loaves. "And I've brought goat's milk, clean cloths, and a few other necessities." Her eyes met his, steady and practical. "News travels fast. Mrs. Peterson at the general store told me when I was in town this morning." Behind Xavier, Jackson appeared in the doorway, still awkwardly holding Lily, who continued to cry. Felicity handed the basket to Xavier and reached for the baby without hesitation. "There now, little one," she cooed, expertly cradling Lily against her shoulder. "Someone's hungry, aren't they?" To Xavier's astonishment, Lily's cries softened to whimpers. Felicity King walked past him into the house as if she belonged there, surveying the makeshift nursery with a critical eye. "I'll need warm water, clean bottles if you have them, cups if you don't, and someone to help me with the goat's milk," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "These babies need feeding, and then we'll sort out the rest." Xavier stood frozen on his own threshold, the basket of bread in his hands, watching as this stranger took command of a situation that had left him paralyzed with fear. For the first time since receiving Sarah's letter, he felt something other than dread, a small, fragile spark of hope. "Well." Felicity glanced back at him, already soothing a second baby. "Are you just going to stand there, Mr. Grayson? We've got 4 hungry little ones who won't wait on ceremony." Xavier exchanged a look with Jackson, who seemed equally bemused. "Yes, madam," Xavier said, finding his voice at last. "Water and cups coming right up." As he moved to follow her instructions, Xavier couldn't help but wonder at the strange turn his life had taken. 4 orphan babies, a ranch to run, and now a forthright woman with bread and practical knowledge walking into his home as if sent by Providence itself. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, at least, the babies would be fed. And that, he decided, was enough to be getting on with. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Felicity directed operations with the efficiency of a cavalry officer, showing Xavier and Jackson how to prepare the goat's milk, diluting it slightly and warming it to the right temperature. She fashioned feeding bottles from what supplies they had, using clean rags over the mouths of small cups to slow the flow for the babies' tiny mouths. "Have you done this before?" Xavier asked as he awkwardly held Thomas, trying to copy Felicity's natural way of cradling and feeding the infants. "I helped raise my younger siblings after my mother died," she replied, not looking up from where she was changing Daisy's soiled clothing. "And I've assisted at births around these parts. Babies aren't so complicated, Mr. Grayson. They need food, warmth, clean bottoms, and love. The rest sorts itself out. Call me Xavier," he said, feeling a flush of embarrassment at his own ineptitude. Thomas had finally latched onto the makeshift bottle and was drinking eagerly. "And I'm much obliged for your help, Miss King." "Felicity," she corrected, efficiently pinning a clean cloth around Daisy. "And you're welcome, though I suspect this is just the beginning of your challenges." Outside, night had fully descended, the moon casting silver light across the ranch yard. Billy had returned from town with supplies, looking relieved to find someone who knew what to do with them. "You can't possibly manage 4 babies and a ranch by yourself," Felicity observed as they settled the now fed and changed infants back into their makeshift beds. "Even with your ranch hands helping." Xavier ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion settling into his bones. "I know, but they're my responsibility now. Sarah trusted me to raise them." Felicity was quiet for a moment, studying him with thoughtful eyes. "I could stay a while," she finally said. "Help you get on your feet with them. I've got my own place to look after, but I could come for a few hours each day, show you what needs doing." The offer took Xavier by surprise. He'd expected her to leave once the immediate crisis was addressed. "That's mighty generous, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not imposition if I'm offering," she replied practically. "Besides, I've got milk goats that need tending anyway. I can bring fresh milk daily." Xavier felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "I'd pay you, of course." A smile flickered across her face. "We can discuss terms tomorrow. For now, you should get some sleep while they're quiet. They'll be hungry again before dawn." As if to punctuate her words, Xavier felt a massive yawn building. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so tired. "Where will you sleep?" he asked, suddenly realizing the impropriety of the situation. "I'll take the rocking chair," she said, nodding to the wooden chair near the fireplace. "I'm used to catching sleep where I can." "I can't ask you to, you didn't ask," she interrupted. "I offered. Besides, it's too late for me to head back to my place now." Xavier wanted to argue further but couldn't find the energy. "Thank you," he said simply. "I don't know what we would have done without you tonight." Felicity's expression softened. "Get some rest, Xavier. Tomorrow we'll be here soon enough." He nodded, taking one last look at the sleeping infants before retreating to his bedroom. As he lay down fully clothed on top of his quilt, Xavier realized that for the first time since receiving Sarah's letter, he felt something close to peace. The babies were fed and sleeping, and someone who knew what they were doing was watching over them. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a start. And sometimes, Xavier thought as sleep claimed him, a start was all you needed. True to Felicity's prediction, dawn arrived with 4 hungry, crying infants. Xavier stumbled from his bedroom to find her already up, heating water at the stove. "Good morning," she said briskly. "Hope you got some sleep. We'll need to establish a routine for these little ones, and quickly." Xavier ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I'm not sure I know what that means." "It means regular feeding times, nap schedules, and a system for keeping them clean and dry," she explained, efficiently preparing the first bottle. "Babies thrive on routine." The next several hours were a crash course in infant care. Felicity showed Xavier how to change diapers, how to burp the babies after feeding, how to swaddle them snugly to help them sleep. His large, calloused hands felt clumsy and oversized compared to her confident movements, but she was patient, demonstrating each task until he managed it on his own. By midday, Xavier's head was spinning with new information. The babies were finally settled for a nap, and Felicity had prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and some of her fresh bread. "You need to hire help," she said as they ate at the kitchen table. "A permanent nanny, at least until they're older." Xavier nodded, knowing she was right. "Don't suppose you'd be interested in the position?" The words left his mouth before he'd fully thought them through. Felicity looked up, surprised. "I have my own place to run, Mr. Grayson Xavier," she corrected herself. "My father left me 20 acres, and I'm determined to make something of it." "What are you raising?" "Goats mainly, some chickens. I've got a vegetable garden that does well enough. I sell cheese, eggs, and produce in town." A hint of pride crept into her voice. "It's not much, but it's mine." Xavier respected her determination. Too many women in these parts were forced to remarry quickly after losing a husband or father, having no means to support themselves. That Felicity had chosen independence spoke volumes about her character. "Well, the offer stands," he said. "Meanwhile, I'm grateful for whatever time you can spare to help us get on our feet." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I can come mornings and evenings for a while. You'll need to hire someone to be here during the day, though." "I'll put the word out," Xavier promised. There must be someone in the territory looking for such work. After their meal, Felicity prepared to leave, promising to return the following morning. Xavier walked her to her wagon, the late spring sun warm on their shoulders. "I've left detailed instructions," she said, handing him several pages of neat handwriting. "Feeding amounts, how to check if they're getting enough, what to do if they seem colicky." Xavier took the papers, momentarily overwhelmed by their contents. "This is mighty thorough." "Babies don't come with instructions, Mr. Grayson," she said with a hint of amusement. "Someone has to write them." As she climbed into her wagon, Xavier was struck by an unexpected reluctance to see her go. In just one day, her practical presence had become a lifeline in his suddenly chaotic world. "Miss King Felicity," he said, placing a hand on the wagon's side. "I want you to know how much I appreciate what you've done. Not many folks would take the time to help a stranger like this." Her eyes softened slightly. "We're not exactly strangers anymore, are we? Not after all those diaper changes." The observation startled a laugh from him, perhaps his first genuine one since receiving Sarah's letter. "No, I suppose we're not." As her wagon disappeared down the dusty road, Xavier turned back to the house, the list of instructions clutched in his hand. 4 sleeping babies awaited inside, along with a future he never could have imagined for himself. But somehow, with Felicity King's unexpected arrival, that future seemed a little less daunting. True to her word, Felicity returned the next morning and every morning thereafter. She arrived at dawn, her wagon loaded with fresh goat's milk, bread, and whatever vegetables were ready from her garden. Each evening, she would stay until the babies were fed and settled for their first sleep of the night, leaving Xavier with detailed instructions for the overnight hours. The arrangement quickly fell into a comfortable routine. Xavier found himself watching the eastern horizon each morning, waiting for the first glimpse of her wagon. When she arrived, the house, which had seemed impossibly chaotic just moments before, would transform under her capable hands. 2 weeks into this new reality, Xavier still hadn't found a permanent nanny. Several women from town had expressed interest, but backed away upon seeing 4 infants instead of 1. Managing quadruplets was simply too daunting a prospect for most. "I've placed advertisements in Helena and Bozeman," Xavier told Felicity one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while the babies slept inside. "But I'm not hopeful." Felicity sipped from a cup of coffee, her expression thoughtful. "What about Mrs. Holloway from church?" "Her youngest just left for college back east." Xavier shook his head. "Already asked. She says at 58 she's too old to start over with babies." A comfortable silence fell between them. In the distance, cattle lowed softly as Xavier's men moved them to a new grazing area. The Double G had suffered somewhat in the past weeks, with Xavier unable to devote his full attention to ranch operations. His foreman was capable, but there were decisions only Xavier could make. "How are you managing your place?" he asked, suddenly realizing how much time Felicity spent at the ranch. "You're here from dawn till dusk most days." "I've arranged with the Peterson boy to look after my animals," she replied. "He's 15 and reliable. I do what needs doing in the evenings and early mornings." Xavier frowned. "That's a heavy load you're carrying, coming here every day on top of your own responsibilities." She shrugged, but he noticed the fatigue around her eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. "They're just babies. They need someone." "Yes, but that someone doesn't have to be you," Xavier pointed out gently. "You've gone above and beyond what any neighbor might do." Felicity was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "When my mother died, I was 16, she finally said. "My youngest sister was just 3. There was no one to help us. My father did his best, but he was lost without my mother. I remember wishing someone would appear with bread and hope just for one day." She glanced at him. No one did. The simple admission hung in the evening air between them. Xavier felt something shift in his understanding of this practical, capable woman who had walked into his life when he needed her most. "Well," he said finally, "I'm grateful you're the kind of person who brings what you once needed yourself." A flush colored her cheeks, visible even in the fading light. "It's nothing so noble. I just know what it's like to be overwhelmed by responsibility you didn't ask for." From inside the house came the first whimpers of a waking baby. Felicity set down her coffee cup and rose. "That'll be Thomas," she said. "He always wakes first for the evening feeding." Xavier stood as well, automatically moving to follow her inside. "I can take him," he offered. "You've done enough today." Felicity paused, studying him with surprise. "You've gotten quite good at this, you know. 2 weeks ago, you looked terrified to hold them." "I had a good teacher," he replied simply. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the strange intimacy that had developed in the crucible of caring for 4 helpless infants together. Then Thomas's cries grew more insistent, breaking the moment. "We'd better get to him before he wakes the girls," Felicity said, turning toward the door. Xavier followed, aware that something had changed between them, though he couldn't have said exactly what. All he knew was that Felicity King had become far more to him than just a neighbor lending a hand. The thought both comforted and unsettled him as they moved together to tend to the babies who had, improbably, brought them into each other's lives. As May turned to June, the Montana countryside exploded into vibrant green, wildflowers dotting the prairies in splashes of purple, yellow, and blue. The babies grew too, their personalities emerging more distinctly each day. Thomas was serious and observant, watching everything with solemn blue eyes. Rose was the most demanding, her lusty cries commanding immediate attention. Daisy was easygoing, content to gurgle happily in her makeshift crib. And little Lily, the smallest, was quietly determined, fighting for every ounce of growth. Xavier found himself growing more confident in his caretaking abilities. He could now change diapers with reasonable efficiency, prepare bottles without supervision, and even tell by the sound of their cries what each baby needed. The ranch hands had gradually overcome their initial awkwardness around the infants, and now frequently stopped by the house to pull faces at the babies, or offer a finger for tiny hands to grasp. The search for a permanent nanny continued without success. Xavier had interviewed several women from as far away as Billings, but none seemed suitable for the unique challenge of quadruplets. Each rejection increased his reliance on Felicity, a fact that left him both grateful and uneasy. He was aware that the arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. She had her own life to lead, her own dreams to pursue. One warm afternoon in late June, Xavier returned from checking cattle in the north pasture to find Felicity sitting on a quilt spread beneath the large cottonwood tree in the yard. The 4 babies were laid out beside her, cooing and kicking at the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. "Fresh air is good for them," she explained as he dismounted and approached, "and they love watching the leaves move in the breeze." Xavier removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. The sight of Felicity surrounded by the babies created an unexpected tightness in his chest. Her honey-brown hair was coming loose from its pins, curling softly around her face in the humidity. She looked as natural there as if she belonged, as if the babies were her own. "You're staring, Mr. Grayson," she observed without looking up from where she was gently tickling Daisy's tummy. Xavier cleared his throat, embarrassed at being caught. "Just thinking how lucky these little ones are to have you looking after them." Now she did look up, her expression unreadable. "And what about you? Are you lucky too?" The question hung between them, weighted with meanings Xavier wasn't sure he was ready to explore. Before he could formulate an answer, Rose began to fuss, providing a welcome distraction. "I think someone's ready for her afternoon bottle," Felicity said, lifting the baby. "Would you mind bringing the basket from the kitchen? I prepared everything before coming out." Xavier nodded, grateful for the task. As he walked to the house, he tried to make sense of the confusion he felt whenever he was around Felicity these days. She had become essential to his daily life, not just for her help with the babies, but for her conversation, her practical outlook, her quiet strength. The thought of her eventually returning to her own life full-time left him with a hollow feeling he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Inside the kitchen, he found the basket she'd mentioned, neatly packed with bottles, clean cloths, and a jar of the salve she made for the baby's occasional rashes. Everything organized, everything thought of that was Felicity's way. She anticipated needs before they arose, solved problems before they became crises. When he returned to the cottonwood tree, he found Felicity singing softly to Rose, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him as a child. The simple melody carried on the warm summer air, and Xavier stood for a moment, basket in hand, reluctant to interrupt the peaceful scene. "My ma used to sing that same song," he said when she finished. Felicity looked up, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Mine too." Funny how some things pass through generations, isn't it? Xavier settled onto the quilt beside her, setting down the basket. "Do you ever think about having your own family?" The question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers gently stroking Rose's cheek. "I did once," she finally said, "before the fever took my parents. I was engaged to a man from Helena, a shop owner's son, but afterward with the farm to run and my siblings to look after." She shrugged. "He didn't want that responsibility. Can't say I blame him." "I blame him," Xavier said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "A man who'd abandon his promises when times get hard isn't worth your time." Felicity gave him a curious look. "That's a generous assessment, coming from a man who suddenly found himself with 4 babies not his own." "That's different," Xavier protested. "They're family. And my siblings weren't." There was no anger in her tone, just a quiet challenge. Xavier felt himself flush. "I didn't mean that as you're right. I spoke out of turn." Her expression softened. "No, you spoke your mind. It's one of the things she stopped, turning her attention back to Rose. "One of the things that makes you a good guardian for these little ones. You understand the importance of keeping your word." Xavier wanted to ask what she had been about to say, but something in her demeanor warned against it. Instead, he reached for Thomas, who was beginning to squirm restlessly on the quilt. "I had a letter from Mrs. Whitmore in Bozeman this morning," he said, changing the subject. "She's interested in the nanny position." Felicity's hand stilled briefly. "Oh, what's she like?" Widow, 53, raised 6 children of her own, comes highly recommended by the pastor of her church. "She sounds perfect," Felicity said, her voice carefully neutral. "When will she arrive?" "That's just it," Xavier said, shifting Thomas to his shoulder. "She wants me to bring the babies to Bozeman to meet them before she commits. Says she needs to see what she's getting into." Felicity nodded slowly. "That's sensible of her." "It's a 3-day journey each way," Xavier continued. "I'd need someone to help with the babies on the trip." Their eyes met over Rose's head, and Xavier saw understanding dawn in Felicity's gaze. "You want me to come with you to Bozeman," she stated. "If you're willing," he confirmed. "I can't manage them alone on such a journey, and there's no one else I trust with them." Felicity was quiet, her gaze dropping to Rose's drowsy face. "When would we leave?" "End of next week, if that works for your schedule. We'd be gone about 10 days, allowing for travel time and a few days in Bozeman. She nodded slowly. I'll need to make arrangements for my place. The Peterson boy can handle the animals, but I'll need someone to check my gardens and harvest what's ready. I'll pay you well for your time, Xavier assured her, and cover any expenses you incur in making arrangements. Felicity's gaze lifted to his, a flicker of something hurt, crossing her features before she masked it. That won't be necessary. I'm helping because I want to, not for payment. Xavier felt he'd somehow misspoken but wasn't sure how. I just don't want you to suffer any hardship because of us. I've told you before, Xavier, it's not a hardship. She rose in a single fluid movement, Rose cradled against her chest. I should get these little ones inside. The sun's getting strong. Xavier watched as she efficiently gathered Daisy as well, leaving him to bring Thomas and Lily. As they walked back to the house together, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just transpired, something he hadn't fully grasped. But with 4 babies and a ranch to manage, there was never enough time to untangle the complex emotions that seemed to swirl around his relationship with Felicity King. All he knew for certain was that the prospect of 10 days traveling with her brought both anticipation and a nervous energy he hadn't felt since his courting days, long before responsibilities and tragedy had reshaped his life. What that meant, he wasn't ready to examine too closely. For now, it was enough to know she would be by his side as they journeyed to Bozeman, the future of their unusual household hanging in the balance. The preparations for the journey to Bozeman consumed the next week. Xavier had a wagon modified with special compartments to hold the babies safely, complete with padding and canvas covers to protect them from sun and dust. Felicity sewed travel clothes for the infants, practical garments that could be easily changed on the road. They plotted their route carefully, identifying places to stop each night where the babies could be properly tended. As the departure date approached, Xavier found himself increasingly aware of what would happen if Mrs. Whitmore accepted the position. Felicity would no longer need to come to the ranch daily. Their time together would naturally diminish. The thought left him more disturbed than he cared to admit. The evening before they were to leave, Xavier sat at his desk after the babies were asleep, attempting to review cattle tallies but finding his mind wandering. A soft knock at the study door drew his attention. "Come in," he called, expecting one of the ranch hands with a last-minute question about operations during his absence. Instead, Felicity entered, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting it before him. "You've been staring at those same papers for an hour." Xavier smiled ruefully. "That obvious, am I?" "Only to someone who's been watching," she replied, then flushed slightly at her own words. "I mean, I noticed you seemed preoccupied." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Join me." After a moment's hesitation, she sat, smoothing her skirts with a practiced gesture. In the lamplight, her features were softened, the practical set of her mouth relaxed into something gentler. "Are you worried about the journey?" she asked. Xavier considered the question. "Not the journey itself. More what comes after." "Mrs. Whitmore, you mean?" he nodded, taking a sip of the coffee she'd brought. "What if she's not right for the babies? Or what if she is and everything changes?" Felicity's gaze was steady. "Change is inevitable, Xavier. These little ones will grow. Your life will find a new normal. And you'll go back to your farm full-time," he said, voicing the thought that had been troubling him most. She looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. Yes, that was always the arrangement. A silence fell between them, weighted with unspoken things. Outside, the night creatures of the Montana summer sang their chorus crickets, frogs from the nearby creek, the occasional hoot of an owl. "I've grown accustomed to having you here," Xavier finally said, the words coming out more gruffly than he intended. Felicity's eyes lifted to his, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. "I've grown accustomed to being here." It wasn't a declaration of feelings, not precisely, but something shifted between them in that moment. An acknowledgement that what had begun as neighborly assistance had evolved into something neither had anticipated. Before Xavier could find words to respond, a baby's cry echoed from the nursery. Felicity rose immediately, the spell broken. "That's Lily," she said. "She needs her late feeding." Xavier stood as well. "I'll come with you." Together they walked to the nursery, where Lily's cries had indeed started in earnest. Xavier lifted her carefully, marveling as always at how tiny she remained compared to her siblings. In just a few weeks, he'd grown so attached to these children that the thought of entrusting them to anyone else, even someone as qualified as Mrs. Whitmore, promised to be filled him with apprehension. Felicity prepared a bottle with practiced efficiency, then surprised him by not taking Lily from his arms. "You feed her," she said softly. "You do it just as well as I do now." The simple vote of confidence warmed him unexpectedly. Xavier settled into the rocking chair, cradling Lily against his chest as he offered her the bottle. She latched on eagerly, her tiny fingers curling around his much larger one. Felicity stood watching them, a complicated expression on her face. "You've come a long way from the terrified man I found that first night." Xavier smiled down at Lily. "Thanks to you." "No," Felicity countered gently. "You had it in you all along, you just needed someone to show you that." When he looked up, she was studying him with an intensity that made his heart beat faster. For a moment he thought she might say more, but then she stepped back, composing herself. "I should finish packing supplies for tomorrow," she said. "The early start will come before we know it." Xavier nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As she left the nursery, he looked down at Lily, now drowsily finishing her bottle. "What do you think, little one?" he whispered. "Has your Uncle Xavier gone and complicated things?" Lily's only response was to close her eyes, milk drunk and content in the safety of his arms. If only adult matters could be resolved so simply, Xavier thought ruefully, as the rocking chair creaked a steady rhythm in the quiet Montana night. They departed at first light, the wagon loaded with everything 4 3-month-old babies might need for a 10-day journey. The ranch hands gathered to see them off, awkwardly patting the infants and wishing Xavier and Felicity safe travels. "Don't you worry about a thing here, boss," Jackson assured him. "We'll keep everything running smooth as silk." Xavier nodded, trusting his foreman implicitly. "Send word to Bozeman if there's any trouble you can't handle." The first day's travel went as well as could be expected with 4 infants. They stopped frequently for feedings and diaper changes, making slow but steady progress toward Bozeman. By sunset, they had reached the small settlement of Pine Creek, where arrangements had been made for them to stay with the local doctor and his wife, who had eagerly offered hospitality upon hearing of the unusual traveling party. Dr. and Mrs. Palmer proved to be gracious hosts, providing a comfortable room for Felicity and the babies, while Xavier took a smaller adjoining chamber. After the babies were settled for their first sleep of the night, the adults gathered in the Palmers' cozy parlor. "Quadruplets are exceedingly rare, Doctor," Palmer remarked, clearly fascinated by the medical uniqueness of the situation. "Your sister must have been a remarkable woman to carry them to term." "She was," Xavier agreed, a familiar pang of grief tightening his chest. "Strong in ways I never fully appreciated until it was too late." Mrs. Palmer, a motherly woman with silver-streaked dark hair, patted his hand sympathetically. "And now you're raising them alone. It's a tremendous undertaking." "Not alone," Xavier corrected, glancing at Felicity. "Miss King has been instrumental in their care." Mrs. Palmer's gaze moved between Xavier and Felicity with interest. "How fortunate that you found each other. Are you planning to make the arrangement permanent?" The innocent question hung in the air. Xavier felt heat rise in his face, while Felicity became suddenly engrossed in straightening her skirts. "We're traveling to Bozeman to meet a potential nanny," Felicity explained, her voice carefully neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore has experience with multiple children." "I see, Mrs." Palmer replied, though her tone suggested she saw more than was being explicitly stated. "Well, I'm sure whatever arrangement you decide upon will be in the best interest of the children." The conversation turned to other topics: the cattle industry in the territory, the Palmers' grown children back east, the unusually mild summer they'd been experiencing. Throughout the evening, Xavier found his attention repeatedly drawn to Felicity, noticing small details he'd somehow missed in their weeks together. The graceful way she gestured when making a point, the dimple that appeared briefly when she smiled, the intelligent spark in her eyes when discussing topics that interested her. When they retired for the night, Xavier found himself standing awkwardly in the hallway outside their rooms, reluctant to say goodnight. "Thank you again for coming on this journey," he said. "I couldn't have managed without you." Felicity smiled, the dim lamplight casting soft shadows across her features. "You underestimate yourself, Xavier Grayson. You're more capable than you know." Before he could respond, a whimper came from within her room. Thomas, by the sound of it, stirring in his sleep. "I should go to him before he wakes the others," she said. Xavier nodded. "Good night, then." "Good night." As she slipped into her room, Xavier remained in the hallway a moment longer, struck by a realization that had been building for weeks. His feelings for Felicity King had progressed far beyond gratitude or even friendship. The recognition was both exhilarating and terrifying. What right did he have to burden her with such feelings when she had already given so much? With a sigh, he entered his own room, closing the door on questions he had no answers for, at least not tonight. The journey continued over the next 2 days, the routine of travel becoming more familiar. By the time they reached Bozeman late on the third afternoon, Xavier and Felicity had developed an efficient system for managing the babies on the road. They communicated with minimal words, anticipating each other's needs and the infant's requirements with a synchronicity that felt almost like a dance. Bozeman itself was considerably larger than the small settlements they'd passed through, boasting proper streets, substantial buildings, and the bustle of a growing town. They had arranged accommodations at the Wilson House, a respectable hotel that had promised adjoining suites suitable for their unusual party. Mrs. Whitmore was scheduled to meet them the following morning, giving them time to rest and prepare the babies. After settling into their rooms and tending to the infant's immediate needs, Xavier found himself standing by the window of their shared sitting room, watching the activity on Bozeman's main street below. "It's quite a town," Felicity observed, joining him at the window. "Growing fast." Xavier nodded. Sarah always wanted to visit. She said it was becoming the Athens of the West, with the college and all. Felicity was quiet for a moment, her shoulder nearly touching his as they stood side by side. "She would be proud of how you're caring for her children." "I hope so," Xavier replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Some days I worry I'm not doing enough, that they deserve better than what a bachelor rancher can provide. Those children have food, shelter, clean clothes, and most importantly, love," Felicity said firmly. "That's more than many children have, even with 2 parents." Xavier turned to look at her, struck by the conviction in her voice. "You really believe that?" "I do." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I've watched you with them, Xavier. You may have been terrified at first, but you've never once shirked your responsibility. You've learned what they need, adapted your life to accommodate them, put their welfare above your own convenience at every turn. That's what makes a good parent: not experience or expertise, but willingness to put the children first." Her words eased something tight in his chest, a doubt he'd been carrying since the day the babies arrived. Thank you for saying that. I only speak the truth as I see it, she replied simply. For a long moment they stood in silence, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, turning Felicity's honey-brown hair to gold. Xavier found himself studying her profile, the straight nose, the determined chin, the soft curve of her lips. Without conscious thought, he reached out, gently touching a strand of hair that had escaped her pins. Felicity went very still, her breath catching audibly. "Xavier," she whispered, his name a question and a caution all at once. Before he could respond, before he could decide whether to withdraw his hand or draw her closer, a sharp knock sounded at their suite door. They stepped apart quickly, Felicity smoothing her hair while Xavier cleared his throat. "Come in," he called, his voice unsteady. A hotel porter entered, carrying a calling card on a small silver tray. "Mrs. Alina Whitmore presents her compliments and asks if she might call on you this evening rather than waiting until tomorrow. She says she's most eager to meet the children." Xavier exchanged a glance with Felicity, who nodded slightly. "Please tell Mrs. Whitmore we would be delighted to receive her," he replied. "Say in 1 hour's time." "Very good, sir." The porter bowed slightly and withdrew. When the door closed, Xavier turned back to Felicity. "Well, it seems we'll be meeting our potential nanny sooner than expected." Felicity nodded, her composure fully restored. "I should change the babies into their best clothes. First impressions matter." As she moved efficiently toward the nursery area of their suite, Xavier couldn't help feeling that a moment of possibility had been lost, interrupted by the very woman who might eventually replace Felicity in the daily care of the children. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor was the sense that time was running out for him to sort through his complicated feelings for the woman who had brought bread and hope into his life, when he needed it most. Mrs. Alina Whitmore proved to be exactly as her letters had suggested: competent, experienced, and no nonsense. A tall woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, she arrived precisely on time, dressed in a practical dark blue dress that spoke of quality without ostentation. "Mr. Grayson," she said, extending a gloved hand. "A pleasure to meet you at last, and this must be Miss King, whom you mentioned in your correspondence." Xavier made the introductions, watching carefully as Mrs. Whitmore's assessing gaze moved from him to Felicity and then to the 4 babies, freshly changed and fed, lying in their traveling bassinets. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the infants. "Of course," Xavier replied. Mrs. Whitmore approached the babies with professional interest, examining each one with careful attention. "They appear healthy and well cared for," she observed. "The small one, Lily, is it? Will need extra attention to ensure she doesn't fall behind in her development." "She's stronger than she looks," Felicity said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone, "and very determined." Mrs. Whitmore nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Yes, I can see that in her eyes. A fighter, this one." For the next hour, Mrs. Whitmore asked detailed questions about the baby's routines, health history, and temperaments. She shared stories of her own experience raising multiple children, including a set of twins, and outlined her philosophy on childcare. Her approach was practical and sensible, if somewhat stricter than what Xavier and Felicity had established. "I believe in firm schedules and clear boundaries," she explained. "Children thrive on knowing exactly what to expect." Xavier nodded, finding nothing to object to in her words, though he noticed Felicity's slight frown. "And your terms?" he inquired. "If we were to reach an agreement, Mrs. Whitmore named a figure that was higher than Xavier had anticipated, but not unreasonable given the unique challenges of caring for quadruplets. "I would require 1 full day off each week, suitable private accommodations, and the authority to manage the children's daily care as I see fit, within general parameters we agree upon." "Those terms seem fair," Xavier acknowledged. "When would you be available to begin?" "I could return with you to your ranch at the conclusion of your stay in Bozeman," she replied. "I have no pressing commitments here." Xavier glanced at Felicity, whose face remained carefully neutral. "That's very accommodating. My foreman would appreciate having me back sooner rather than later." Mrs. Whitmore rose, smoothing her skirts. "I should leave you to your evening. The little ones will need their rest, and we've had quite enough excitement for one day. Shall we say tomorrow afternoon for further discussion? By then, I will have drafted a formal agreement for your consideration." Xavier escorted her to the door, thanking her for coming. When she had gone, he turned to find Felicity already tending to the babies, her back to him. "What did you think?" he asked, approaching cautiously. Felicity continued tucking a blanket around Rose without looking up. "She seems very competent, experienced." "But," Xavier prompted, sensing her reservation, now she did turn, her expression troubled. "She's rather rigid in her approach. These babies have already experienced trauma, losing their parents so young. They need warmth and flexibility as much as they need schedules." Xavier considered her words. "You don't think she would provide that?" "I think she would care for them conscientiously," Felicity replied carefully. "Whether she would love them is another matter." The distinction struck Xavier forcefully. He had been so focused on finding someone qualified that he hadn't fully considered the emotional component of the relationship. These children had already lost their parents. They deserved a caretaker who would offer not just competent management but genuine affection. "What would you do?" he asked, watching as Felicity gently stroked Daisy's cheek. "If you were in my position." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers continuing their gentle movement. "I would remember that we're not just hiring someone to feed and change them. We're choosing the person who will shape their earliest memories, their sense of security, their understanding of what family means." Her use of "we" didn't escape Xavier's notice, nor did the passion behind her words. "You care about them," he said softly. "Not just as a responsibility you've taken on, but truly care." Felicity's eyes met his, something vulnerable and honest in her gaze. "How could I not? I've held them every day since they were 3 months old. I've watched them grow, seen their personalities emerge. There." She hesitated, then finished simply, "They're precious to me." The admission hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Before Xavier could respond, Thomas began to fuss, quickly followed by Rose. The moment of connection broke as they both turned their attention to the babies, the conversation necessarily postponed. But as they moved through the familiar routine of evening care, Xavier found himself watching Felicity with new eyes, seeing not just her competence, but the genuine love that infused every interaction with the children. And for the first time, he allowed himself to consider a possibility that had been hovering at the edges of his consciousness for weeks. Perhaps the solution to his dilemma had been right in front of him all along. The next day dawned clear and bright, the Montana summer in full glory. Xavier woke early, his mind made up after a night of consideration. He dressed quickly and left a note for Felicity, who was still sleeping in the adjoining room with the babies, explaining that he had business in town and would return by mid-morning. His first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent a message to Jackson at the ranch, requesting specific items to be prepared for his return. Next, he visited Bozeman's premier jeweler, where he spent a considerable amount of time selecting a particular item. Finally, he stopped at a florist, returning to the hotel with his purchases carefully concealed. When he entered their suite, he found Felicity in the sitting room, feeding Lily while the other babies played on a blanket spread on the floor. She looked up with surprise. "You're back earlier than I expected. Did you have a productive morning?" Xavier nodded, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since his youth. "Very. Where are we with preparations for Mrs. Whitmore's visit this afternoon? The babies are bathed and will be in their best clothes. I've prepared a list of their current schedules and preferences, as you asked. She studied him curiously. Is everything all right? You seem different this morning. Xavier took a deep breath. I've been doing some thinking about Mrs. Whitmore. Oh, Felicity's expression became guarded. Have you decided to accept her terms? Actually, I've decided not to hire her at all. Felicity's eyes widened. But who will care for the babies? You said yourself you can't manage them and the ranch alone. I know. Xavier moved closer, his heart pounding uncomfortably in his chest. That's why I'm hoping for a different solution altogether. Before he could continue, a knock at the door interrupted them. Xavier sighed, frustrated by the timing. That will be Mrs. Whitmore, Felicity said, rising with Lily still in her arms. What shall I tell her? I'll speak with her, Xavier replied. Would you mind taking the babies into the other room for a few minutes? This won't take long. Felicity nodded, gathering the other infants and retreating to the nursery area. Xavier straightened his vest, ran a hand through his hair, and opened the door. Mrs. Whitmore stood in the hallway, impeccably dressed as before, a document case in her hands. Good afternoon, Mr. Grayson. I trust the children are well today. Very well, thank you, Xavier replied, gesturing her inside. Please have a seat. There's something I need to discuss with you. Mrs. Whitmore settled herself on the sofa, her posture perfectly upright. I've prepared the agreement as promised, she said, opening her case and withdrawing several sheets of paper. All quite standard, I assure you. Xavier remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back. Mrs. Whitmore, I want to thank you for your interest in the position and for taking the time to meet with us. However, I've decided to pursue a different arrangement for the children's care. The older woman's eyebrows rose slightly, but she betrayed no other sign of surprise. I see. May I ask what led to this decision? If there was something in my approach that concerned you, perhaps we could discuss modifications. It's nothing you've done or said, Xavier assured her. You're clearly highly qualified. It's simply that I've realized there's another solution that would better suit our particular situation. Mrs. Whitmore studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. Would this solution happen to involve Miss King? Xavier felt heat rise in his face. It might. I thought as much, Mrs. Whitmore said, returning the papers to her case. I observed how she looks at those children and how she looks at you, for that matter. Some arrangements develop naturally, Mr. Grayson, and it would be foolish to disrupt them without good reason. Xavier was taken aback by her perception. You're not disappointed, my dear man. I'm 61 years old. I've seen enough of life to recognize when I'm superfluous to a situation. She rose, closing her case with a decisive snap. Besides, I received another offer just this morning from a family with triplets in Helena. Less travel for me, which at my age is no small consideration. Relief washed over Xavier. Then we part on good terms, the best, she assured him, extending her hand. I wish you, Miss King, and those 4 little ones every happiness. After Mrs. Whitmore departed, Xavier stood for a moment collecting his thoughts. Everything was proceeding differently than he had planned, but perhaps that was fitting. Nothing about his life had followed the expected path since the day Felicity King arrived with bread and hope. Is she gone? Xavier turned to find Felicity standing in the doorway of the nursery, Lily still cradled in her arms. Yes, he confirmed. And she took the news quite well, better than I expected, in fact. Felicity approached slowly. And now, what is this different solution you mentioned? Xavier took a deep breath. Before I explain, there's something I need to say to you, something I should have said weeks ago. He moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, the slight tremble of her lips as she waited. Felicity King, you walked into my life when I was at my lowest point. You brought practical help when I needed it desperately, but you gave me something far more valuable than that. You brought hope back into a house that had only known grief. You showed me that I could be more than I believed possible, that I could care for these children properly. He reached out, gently touching Lily's tiny hand where it rested against Felicity's shoulder. But somewhere along the way, something changed. I found myself watching for your wagon every morning, missing you when you left each evening. The babies weren't the only ones who came to depend on your presence. Felicity's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. Xavier, please, let me finish while I still have the courage, he interrupted gently. I know this is sudden, perhaps even foolish. We've known each other only a few months. But in that time, you've become essential to me not just for the help you provide with the children, but for the way you make me feel when you're near. The way you challenge me, support me, make me laugh even on the hardest days. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. I went into town this morning to buy this. It's not fancy, nothing like what a fine lady from back east might expect, but it's honest like everything between us has been. Opening the box, he revealed a simple gold ring set with a small, perfect sapphire. Felicity King, would you consider becoming not just a helper to these children but their mother? Would you consider becoming my wife? Felicity stared at the ring, then at Xavier, her expression a complex mixture of shock, hope, and uncertainty. I never expected. I know it's sudden, Xavier acknowledged. And if you need time to consider, I understand completely. But I want you to know that this isn't just about the babies, though they adore you as much as I do. This is about us, you and me, and the life we could build together. Tears welled in Felicity's eyes. But my farm, everything I've worked for. We could incorporate your land into the Double G, Xavier suggested. Run the goats alongside the cattle, expand your gardens, or if you prefer to keep it separate, we could hire someone to manage it for you. Whatever you want, Felicity. I'm not asking you to give up your dreams just to consider sharing them with me. A tear spilled down her cheek. I never thought. After James left, I convinced myself that I wasn't meant for marriage and family, that my path was to be independent, self-sufficient. You can still be those things, Xavier assured her. Being part of a family, our family, wouldn't change who you are. It would just mean you wouldn't have to face life's challenges alone anymore. Lily chose that moment to reach out and grab a strand of Felicity's hair, tugging it with surprising strength for such a tiny baby. The unexpected action startled a laugh from Felicity, breaking the tension of the moment. She always did have perfect timing, Felicity said, gently disentangling the baby's fingers. Then she looked back at Xavier, her expression clearing, resolve replacing uncertainty. Yes, Xavier blinked, not quite daring to believe. Yes, yes, Xavier Grayson, I will marry you. Her smile was radiant through her tears. Not because these babies need a mother, though they do. Not because it's practical, though it is. But because somewhere between that first night with bread and hope and today, I fell in love with you. Joy surged through Xavier, more powerful than anything he'd ever experienced. He carefully took Lily from Felicity's arms, placing the baby in her bassinet nearby. Then he returned to Felicity, taking her hands in his. May I? He asked, holding up the ring. She nodded, extending her left hand. Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger, relieved to find it fit perfectly. It's beautiful, she whispered, admiring how the sapphire caught the light. Like you, Xavier replied, then immediately flushed at his own sentimentality. I mean, Felicity laughed, the sound like music. Don't you dare take that back, Xavier Grayson. A woman likes to be told she's beautiful, especially by the man she's agreed to marry. Their eyes met, and for a moment they simply stood there, hands clasped, the enormity of their decision settling around them. Then, with a boldness that surprised even himself, Xavier leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, respectful of their short acquaintance yet promising of deeper passion to come. When they separated, Felicity's eyes remained closed for a moment, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," Xavier admitted. "So have I," Felicity confessed, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "Though I never imagined it would happen quite like this." From the nursery area came a chorus of baby sounds, a coo from Thomas, a gurgle from Rose, a whimper from Daisy that suggested she was waking from her nap. Lily, already awake, began to fuss in her bassinet. "Duty calls," Felicity said with a smile. "Though I suppose now it's our duty officially." "It always was," Xavier replied, taking her hand as they moved toward the nursery together. "From the moment you walked in with that loaf of bread." Their life together began that very day, not waiting for ceremony or social convention. They sent telegraphs announcing their engagement to Jackson at the ranch, to Felicity's remaining sibling in California, to the few friends they each could claim. Mrs. Whitmore, upon receiving the news, sent a fine silver baby cup for each of the infants, along with her heartfelt congratulations. They were married 2 weeks later in Bozeman's small church, with the babies present in their finest clothes, attended by Mrs. Palmer, who had traveled from Pine Creek, specifically for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, the celebration afterward intimate, but the joy that filled the small gathering was palpable to all present. "I never thought I'd see the day," Jackson commented as he congratulated them at the small reception. Xavier Grayson, confirmed bachelor, married with 4 children, all in the span of a few months. Xavier laughed, his arm around Felicity's waist. "Life has a way of surprising you." "Indeed it does," Felicity agreed, her gaze moving to where the babies were being cooed over by the ladies of the church. "Though I wouldn't change a moment of it." Their return journey to the Double G was slower than their trip to Bozeman had been, the new family stopping frequently to enjoy the summer countryside, picnicking beside streams and spending nights in small inns along the way. By the time they arrived at the ranch, word of their marriage had spread throughout the county, and they were greeted by neighbors bearing food, gifts, and offers of assistance. The ranch house, which had seemed so chaotic and overwhelming to Xavier that first night with the babies, transformed under Felicity's care into a true home. She incorporated her goats and gardening knowledge into ranch operations, creating a more diverse and sustainable enterprise than the Double G had been before. Xavier found himself learning about cheese making and vegetable preservation alongside his cattle management, the two of them building a partnership that encompassed all aspects of their lives. The babies thrived under their combined care. Even little Lily began to catch up to her siblings, her determined spirit matched by the devoted attention of her new parents. By their first birthday, all 4 were crawling, babbling, and displaying the distinct personalities that would shape them into the individuals they would become. On the anniversary of the day Felicity had first arrived with bread and hope, Xavier surprised her with a special dinner after the children were asleep. He had cooked it himself, a skill he'd been secretly learning from Mrs. Peterson in town, and set the table with the fine china his mother had left him. "What's the occasion?" Felicity asked, delighted by his efforts. "1 year ago today, you saved me," Xavier replied, taking her hand across the table. "You walked into my life with practical help and stayed to become its heart." Felicity squeezed his hand, her eyes soft in the candlelight. "We saved each other, I think. I was so determined to be independent that I'd built walls around my heart. You and those 4 little ones broke them down." "Speaking of those 4, Xavier said, a hint of mischief in his eyes, "how would you feel about adding to our brood? Perhaps one that's biologically ours to go along with our 4 by heart." Felicity's smile was radiant. "I thought you'd never ask, though you should know." "It might be sooner than you think." Xavier's eyes widened. "Are you saying," she nodded, tears of joy brimming. "Dr. Palmer confirmed it when we visited last week. Next spring, the Quads will have a little brother or sister." Xavier rose from his chair, moving around the table to kneel beside his wife. He placed a gentle hand on her still flat abdomen, overwhelmed by the miracle of their love made manifest. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "When Sarah's letter came, I thought my life as I knew it was over. I never imagined it was just beginning." Felicity leaned down to kiss him, her lips soft and familiar now after months of marriage. "That's the thing about hope, Xavier. Once you let it in, it has a way of multiplying just like love, just like family." Outside, the Montana night spread its star-studded canopy over the Double G Ranch. Inside, surrounded by the sleeping children who had brought them together and the promise of new life to come, Xavier and Felicity Grayson held each other close, grateful for the unexpected journey that had led them to each other, a journey that had begun with 4 babies, a loaf of bread, and the hope that had transformed them all.